Actually, I'm gonna continue what I was on my way into when we met the very first time, and try to specify some points around what is imagination, and actually much more important, what does imagination do? But first, I would like to make a kind of exercise with you. I would like you to try and remember what you were thinking in the last 30 seconds. Try to do that. Well, you may think it's not very hard, but my claim here is that that's actually, in fact, impossible. You're not able to give me a precise account of what you were thinking for the last 30 seconds. And maybe that was because you were thinking about something else and not paying attention to what I said. That often happens when I do the same tests or the same check with my students. But even if I asked you what you were thinking about, instead of listening to me, you will not be able to tell me for sure. You will be able to give me some hints. You will be able to give me a partial explanation, but you won't be able to get everything. Maybe you even have a sort of a sense that you were thinking on many things at the same time. You are actually able to juggle listening to me while remembering something your boyfriend or girlfriend told you this morning, or remembering something you have to buy in the supermarket. Can all of you follow me? Would all of you have the same experience as I'm describing here? Yeah. So what we're talking about now, and what you experience here, is the imagination. That's as simple as it is. But as you probably will be aware of immediately, that this is not very simple, as it is not very simple to understand what one dreamt about last night when one had a nightmare. So the imagination is something that we may talk about, and that we increasingly talk about in the humanities, but it's also something that's elusive. It's something that affects something else. But the fact that it is elusive doesn't mean it's not strong, or it doesn't mean that it doesn't have really serious consequences, at points very, very serious consequences. Let's take the example of what's going on in Israel for the moment. People dying in increasing numbers. Because of what? Because of two groups of people. They imagine that they should have a state or life to live at the same spot of the world. Of course, there are many other issues involved in this, but basically they have the same idea. They have the same idea that once was an imagination of a sort. So the imagination may be extremely elusive, but it's not weak, and it has a lot of consequences. So that's where I want to start. I'm going to continue, as said, a little bit with what I was talking about when we met the first time. And I think I was on my way into something about determination. And I think my little example here, and I hope my little example here has shown you that when we talk about imagination, we also talk about a limit to determinations. We talk about a limit to determination because we understand that this has to do with actions and activity. There's not an essential truth that we'll find at the bottom of everything. We have to spread it out and accept that this is processual somehow. And one of the reasons we have chosen in Copenhagen to focus on Tingbjerg, and here I just quote the description that's in the project plan, is that one of the most interesting changes in terms of public imagination that you will find in Denmark for the last 30 years or so is exactly the change that we now see manifested in the attempt of rebuilding Tingbjerg completely. As you are aware, there will be built 1,000 new homes out there, and the area will be changed forever, completely. The existing inhabitants will probably stay there, but even that is not entirely clear due to various issues of politics we don't have time to go into here. So what we see in the development of Tingbjerg, and not least since the 90s, where the first refugees, for instance, from Somalia started to arrive in Denmark, is a change in what it means to live. And again, it's elusive, because what are these changes about? That has been debated for 30 years in Denmark. Are refugees something that endanger the Danish way of life? Is refugee an asset? Is it something we have to receive? Or what are we talking about? What is clear is that the emergence and or the arrival of refugees from the Middle East, in particular Muslim refugees, has triggered a continuous anxiety in Denmark, which exactly, I would argue, has to do with the imagination of, as we put it in the description, of what a good life should be. And in Denmark, being a Scandinavian welfare society, building and dwelling and living in a building that one puts at the center of one's life is a key imaginary feature of life. So once you start messing around with that, and that's exactly what's happening in areas like Tingbjerg, and not only for the Danes, ethnic Danes that live there, but for the whole of society, then you start coming up with against hard and tough effects and consequences, and that's exactly what we see. So this just to argue that the imagination is there. It's not language. It's not all the functional issues that one may appoint to design traditionally, also to architecture. You know the famous but actually nonsensical statement of form follows function. But that's an example of how design is still seen. It's beyond that. It sort of involves with, let's say, language, and it involves with the alleged functions of architecture in a way. So when we talk about public imagination, we talk about, at the same time, what a good life should be in terms of living in a building, in terms of shelter, so to speak, with a basic function of architecture. Well, we also talk about a constantly moving topic, as you experienced in your own mind a few moments ago. And if it's not constantly repeated, so to speak, if it's not constantly the imagination of good life in a building, so to speak, is constantly repeated, then it then it changes and moves into different places where things may happen, as we see in Tingbjerg. So when we talk about Tingbjerg as something which challenged a certain way of imagining a living in architecture in Copenhagen, we in fact also see a challenge of the entire Danish way of life. Many people who supports multiculturalism in Denmark and supports openness towards the refugees or migrants, they continuously will argue that we only have 5% Muslims in Denmark. What problem could that possibly cause? We've had one terrorist attack. What are we talking about? That was once a crazy guy attacking the Jewish synagogue in the middle of Copenhagen. So what's the worry? But the worry is not about numbers. It's not about 5% Muslims. The worry is in the imaginary field. It's like a dream world come real. And that, I think, is one of the most interesting aspects, and of course, one of the most serious aspects of the imagination. And that's a kind of Pandora's box that we're opening up when we start talking about the public imagination. So we may work in terms of numbers, in terms of structures, in terms of language, in terms of functions, in all different sorts of ways that are relatively well-defined and can be measured and be accounted for. But we still involve that with imagination. in a number of ways, and that's where it starts to slip in a certain sense. We have in the initial discussions in Copenhagen, trying to in particular, perhaps from the university people's point of view, opening up the issue of itinerant platform with regard to Tingbjerg. We've talked about two ecologies, namely a social ecology and a visual ecology. That means an environment of images, to put it short, and an environment of social problems, for instance, some of the problems I just described. And we may also further think about an architectural typology, an architectural ecology, exactly of the sort that you see in many projects being set up and created in SIAC and elsewhere. And one of the interesting aspects of some of the points I'm trying to make about the imagination is that across the different ecologies, the imagination actually opens a possibility to understand how a social ecology will interact and blend with a visual ecology, which will further blend with an architectural ecology. And if you move on to some academic definitions of the imagination, of which there are not that many. It's not been a huge topic of Western thinking, and I'm first and foremost referring to Western thinking. I'm sorry for this limitation on my side, but let's take some of them nevertheless. The first one, I hope everyone can see here. The first one is from a philosopher called Castoriadis, that says social imaginary significations create a proper world for the society considered. In fact, they are this world, and they shape the psyche of individuals. Now, this definition is not that easy. So what we may take away from this right now is that it simply means something, and it means something serious, that just as I tried to exemplify before. Let's take another definition from an Indian anthropologist called Arjun Appadrai, who talks about a situation in global culture where the imagination has broken out of the spatial expressive space of art, myth, and ritual and become a social work. What does that mean? It means that, for one thing at least, that the imagination is not constrained into, let's say, philosophy or rituals of religion or art, for instance, taking shape in different works of architect that we would like to refer to, Le Corbusier or Bjarke Ingels or whoever. No, the imagination is distributed across the public domain, for instance. It is there, and it means a lot everywhere it is. The third group of, the third definition, actually two. One is from a preeminent French religious scholar called Henri Coppin that started Shiism, Islam for his whole life. And his major work was a study of angels in the Sufi tradition of Shiite religion. And one of Coppin's points that I find very, very interesting was that actually the phenomenon of an angel was as real as hard fact if you allowed it a sort of reality defined by the imaginary and the imagination. So we might actually conceive of angels as something that in their own domain of the imagination is as real as everything else. Another one, more famous, Gaston Bachelard, who wrote explicitly on space, talks at a point about the fundamental term that corresponds to the imagination is not image, but imaginary. Saying to the imaginary, imagination is essentially open, evasive. Within the human psyche, it is the experience capable of opening the capacity for innovation. What runs through these definitions, and we don't have time to go more into academic detail here, but what runs through these definitions, and you will get the PowerPoint so you can read them again and perhaps consult the references if you're interested. But what we read through this is this moving, non-determinative character, for one thing. A second thing that goes through this is the sort of pervasive, spreading, emerging character of the imagination. That the imagination is actually something that is a reality of a wider world. It's not only for artists or architects, it's also distributed in every piece of a city like Los Angeles. That's maybe why there's something called Los Angeles at the end of the day for the humans that visits the city or decides to make an endeavor to travel far to see what is there. So the imagination in a sense, in this debate, and mind you that I talk about here, and most of the authors here talk not about the imagination as a singular, individual, psychological phenomenon, such as we started, but we talk of the imaginary, which is a sense of a collective, a plural form of individual imagination, as you experience, or you experience just before, or every night when you dream. The imaginary is something that creates frameworks for understanding what, let's say, with my example from before, a good life in a city should be in Denmark, vis-a-vis a good life in a city in Hargeisa, and vis-a-vis a good life in a city such as Los Angeles. To give you a little bit more specific, definition of how to move on with this. Because as I said, there's not that much research into the imagination. One of the big research areas that are related to this is the psychology of creativity, which is a pretty big field, not least in the US. And there's a number of different experiments. Actually, they do lab experiments with people to understand what is creativity, how is creativity placed in the brain, and how does it work in different contexts and so on. But beyond that, it's most speculation. And in particular, when the imagination gets to be imaginary or gets to be public, gets to be collective, summing up with cultures and social definitions and so on, there's almost nothing. But one interesting definition that I keep returning to is this guy, again, the same, Castoriadis, a French-Greek philosopher that worked for 25 years with the philosophy of imagination before he died in 1997. And he defines it in a way I think is actually not too useless, so to speak, also for architects and for creative people that shape things, so to speak. And he argues that you have to understand the imaginary, and now we're talking about the imaginary, as a social institution. And by that, he means a social organization. It's a social organization that interrelates with other social organizations, such as language and such as functions. So we may say that an urban area like Los Angeles, Hargeisa, and Copenhagen are actually an organization of a sort which involves with the imaginary as a specific aspect of this organization. And he defines, and this is just a definition which opens the game, so to speak. He defines this way of looking at the imagination and the imaginary as what I would like to call a topology. It's a system of relations between what he terms functions, symbols, and the imaginary. And the point is that these three areas, and again, this is an example, it could be many more areas actually, but this is just a simple and relatively straightforward definition. These three areas, or these three dimensions of the functional, the symbolic, and the imaginary are related in specific ways. The function of the functional, the end goal or the finality of the functional cannot be conceived without the imaginary. It gives the finality a certain direction. So a hot dog eaten in Los Angeles is not the same as a hot dog in Copenhagen, and it's not the same definitely as a hot dog in Hargeisa, where you won't get one because it's made of pig meat. So the telos or the finality of the functional would not make any sense without the imaginary. And I can go into great length with this. I don't have time for that. But the same applies, but differently, to the symbolic. The symbolic as a kind of language, as a kind of system of meaning, wouldn't come together in the way it does if it wasn't for the imaginary. It wouldn't be able to establish the codes it does if it wasn't for the imaginary. So the finality of the functional and the systemic coherence of language that you know, if you say, I want a hot dog, you know how to say it, and you know how to put the words in this sequence, what the linguists would call the conventions of language that makes it speakable, would not be able to work, so to speak, without the imaginary. So he says also, and now I take the quote, without the imaginary, and that's to the left in the slide, any determination of both the symbolic and the functional, the specificity and the unity of language, the way to put the words in the sentence, I want a hot dog, the orientation and the finality of functions, namely that you know that the hot dog is going to go into your mouth and not into your ears to say something, remain incomplete and finally incomprehensible. Now, this definition of the imaginary actually displaces it. So we haven't found out what the imaginary is. Some of you may argue that this is a strange definition because a definition should say it tells what the imaginary is. But that's where it becomes non-determinative, because the imaginary is something that appears over distance from somewhere else. Exactly like your experience in the small exercise we started with. But that doesn't make it weak. It makes it more complex, perhaps, and it makes it something with a lot of consequences. Why do we strive, for instance, in the north of the globe for growth, for economical growth? We don't need it. That's an imaginary issue. Why were 6 million Jews killed during the Second World War? It was an imaginary solution to what? Well, something imaginary. As Castoriadis, in fact, used Auschwitz as an example once in a small, beautiful movie that I can upload. It's in French. But he says imaginary is not about marketing or smart new ideas for commodities. Actually, Auschwitz is as creative and imaginary in that sense as Notre Dame de Paris, the big medieval cathedral. So actually, a lot of imagination went into Auschwitz. And if you study the history of Auschwitz, you will know that the pervert beasts that conducted this, they had a lot of problems going on all the way through. I will not tire you with that. But what we see is then that when we talk about something like the public imagination, we're talking about much more, would be my argument, than merely a term for something we want to do. We're actually talking about a force which is really important, not only for creative processes, but also, for instance, these kind of chunks that you are developing and constructing in these weeks and the following. So yeah, no, I have, well, let me see. Yeah, I have a very, very bad drawing here. But I hope you can see it says in top functional, to the left symbolic, and to the right imaginary. And you see in the middle, there's a crossed field. So it is in this common set where functional, symbolic, and imaginary meet that we find the real effect and the real importance of something like the public imagination. And of course, we may see that, and now again, I'm speaking about the point of departure for the university people, we may see that something we call social ecologies statement with regard to people that are part of the organization of changing Tingbjerg, that feed into something that we could call a visual ecology, a lot of images or videos or whatever that relates to Tingbjerg somehow. But at the end of the day, these kinds of ecologies, each with their own symbols and functions, they, following what we just said, what we just went through, they are driven in a sense, and that's where this stupid graphic makes some sense, I think, are driven by a certain public imagination. We don't need to change Tingbjerg. It's senseless. Maybe it will be a good business for the municipality of Copenhagen. It probably will. And that's somebody that got that point, I can tell you for sure. But actually, we don't need to change Tingbjerg. And for some architectural historians, it's a crime, because we're changing the fundamental character of the work that was set up and which is a world-renowned masterpiece of modern settlement architecture. So we don't need to do it. Or actually, we need to do it because the public imagination demands it, right? The public imagination demands things being done by certain, to certain areas where there are migrants, because these migrants are imagined to carry problems with them, almost like a coronavirus that you cannot solve in other ways. Now, this is not a debate on migration and refugee policies and so on, but I hope you get my point. Let me give you a few more cues to how this very abstract definition of functional, symbolic, and imaginary could be taken. And I'm referring here to a very interesting urban geographer called Michael Swift, a British from Warwick University, who developed over 30 years a theory of what he called non-representational meaning. And he was, one of the ideas of non-representational meaning was that it was closely related to exactly what I started with, how the imagination drives the body to perceive or experience something in a context like a city, like Tingbjerg or Los Angeles. And he would talk about the need to understand how experience of city life, what Kevin Lynch in the 60s called the image of the city, or later what was dubbed life in between buildings by the Danish architect Jan Gehl, that these issues could be summoned in what he called non-representation models of the world. And he defines four exemplary such models: time, space as systems, practice as system, subject as system, and agency as system. I'm not going to go much more into that. We don't have time for that. But in each of these four models, you see perhaps as the start of an indication of how the imaginary can be traced and how the effects of the imaginary in terms of functional and symbolic will be identifiable somehow. And all of these have to do with action. And we've been used to, again, in the West, most of all, to think about philosophy or science or even architecture to be about determinate issues. In architecture, it's about the work, right? It's always about a well-defined function or well-defined work or well-defined style or well-defined topics such as deconstruction, to mention something that has been important for architects for the last 20, 30 years. But actually what Swift here and what follows from what I just tried to introduce to you is that processes are much more important, and architecture has got to redefine itself towards a more processual approach. And I think that's one of the important backgrounds for this project we're all participating in, Itinerant Platform. So I know the SAIC people will have to forgive me a little bit here, but I found from the website of SAIC an example that I used to introduce what SAIC do to the university people here in Copenhagen, and you see that in the middle. And what's this? It's a high-rise, and again, I'm not talking as an architect here. I'm talking as an observer, outside observer, if you like. It looks like architecture, but it's not. It is a bookshelf, elements of a concrete construction, and some water pipings that come together like something, if you don't look close, that could have been drawn by Le Corbusier. But of course, it's not. It's actually a good example, I guess, and with that we can debate later on, of what Frederick and Christopher has defined as chunks. So this is architecture made by chunks. And that means that actually in each of these pieces of this work, we see some sort of relationship between functional, symbolic, and imaginary. And we see some relation between functional, symbolic, and public imagination of the urban taking place in a work like this. But what's important is that we don't see a specific form of public imagination, such as abundance of kindergartens or an abundance of small green gardens for one family, and all the other things you would relate to the Scandinavian welfare model. We see a public imagination of a world pervaded by chunks of whatever kind that we can compose and importantly recompose. This image, we would argue, is actually an image that constructs itself at the same time as it's decomposed or deconstructs itself, if you like. And the meaning that you attach to it is covered or carried by the elements themselves. And it functions actually quite well as architecture. I also have referred to the two works above. To the left, it's Marcel Duchamp's Fountain from 1917. Probably aware of that, the first ready-made in art history of the 20th century. And the second one is called One and Three Chairs. And I think I talked a little bit about these when we met the first time. It's a work by Joseph Kossut, an artist from New York, part of the conceptual movement in the 60s, 70s, and up till today, which worked with, on the one side, analyzing what is actually the meaning of art. That was the main interest of them, not art as such, but the meaning of art. But then on the other hand, they also managed by this kind of research or this kind of art to dedicate or to construct objects that carried meaning in themselves, but not meaning in a functional or symbolic sense, not well-defined coded meaning or well-defined functions, but imaginary meaning. So One and Three Chairs, what is it saying, actually? It's not saying anything strict in a functional or symbolic sense. It's a definition of a chair, a real chair, and a picture of a chair. That's what you see on the small image. But what's the point of it? The point is lying somewhere else. The point is lying in what you can open towards the imagination or the imaginary by creating constructions like this. And I think this is not very far away from what you're doing when you're working with chunks. And I don't know what I'm done now. I don't know exactly what the conclusion of this is, but I think that one thing that we can say without hesitating too much is that if the imagination and the imaginary as an organization has this importance, then it's something that's interesting to look at, and then it's something that may very importantly change the way we look at architecture. Thank you.